I just kind of wanted to pick your brain a bit about the role of reforms. In your lecture, you talked a lot about the role of reforms. Peter's reforms being really fundamental in the formation of the Russian imperial state. And I just wanted to know if you thought that the reforms of Alexander II were as influential, what their long-term impacts were on the empire as kind of a political subject, or not political subject, as a state, namely the emancipation of the serfs. I was just wondering if you could touch on that.
Sure. Where to begin and end? In both cases, it seems to me, you've got emperors attempting to make pretty radical reforms, fundamentally in order to preserve the regime and the state, but to make it, to adapt it to changing contexts and challenges. That as a broad generalization. I think the main difference, in a sense, is that Peter is, in one sense, reinforcing traditional principles in a new guise. In other words, he is maintaining the absolute monarchy, its alliance with the landowning, the nobility. He's retaining it, but adapting it to new circumstances. Now, the thing about Alexander II's reform is that they do, to some extent, break with fundamental tradition, in the sense that, here you are introducing elements. I say elements, not by any means the complete baggage of Western constitutional and to some extent liberal principles. The new judicial system is very much a sort of alien implant. It doesn't fit into the traditions of authoritarian statehood in Russia. The Zemstvos, the local government bodies, well, you could argue that they carry further reforms introduced by Catherine II, but the fact that they are all class is a break with tradition. What I'm trying to say is that actually, to a greater extent than with Peter, Alexander's reforms introduce a contradictory element into the Russian polity. It's not that there weren't problems before with introducing, institutions, principles whose origins lay in Latin Europe. There were sometimes, but we are still operating in the era of European absolutism. And therefore, introducing these principles is refining, improving, modernizing, adapting the system of government. Once you get into the mid-19th century, in other words, the Victorian era, and begin introducing Victorian era principles from Europe, you are then beginning to introduce principles which, in a genuine sense, are subversive in terms of the traditions of authoritarian monarchy and statehood. I'm not at all sure you could avoid doing that, and certainly when Alexander did introduce these changes, they were very generally seen, not quite universally, but very generally seen, not just by many people as being good in principle, better system of justice, more a way of bringing potentially all groups into local government by the Zemstvos, but also they were seen as state-of-the-art, modern, and therefore changes which would make Russia more powerful, not just more free, but more powerful. One might make the parallels with the 1970s and 80s, or certainly the 1980s, when Reaganite, Thatcherite principles were supported by many people, not just because they liked the principles involved, but because they thought this would make their countries more efficient, more richer, more powerful, etc., etc., etc. So, I think it's worth making those comparisons. One is to some extent comparing eras as much as, the specific reforms. But undoubtedly, it isn't just conservatism and prejudice. Undoubtedly, the reforms of Alexander II, although in many respects essential to modernization, they do introduce into the Russian polity conflicts which are never resolved and which play a role in the destruction of the monarchy in 1917 and of the society it sustained. Now, of course, the traditional liberal view is that what was wrong was not the initial reforms of Alexander II, but that they were not carried to their logical conclusion, both in terms of some kind of overall representative body, under Alexander II, and then more broadly, a whole gamut of policies which would have increased constitutional, liberal, the spread of these kind of principles, etc., in Russia. To which the conservative response was that actually the Russian Empire as it was then, and perhaps any empire as it ever was likely to be, could not be held together and governed effectively by these sorts of constitutional liberal principles. So, I'm throwing it out to you. You can. I'm not giving you a definite answer to that, but it's worth thinking, I think, in these kind of ways. And certainly, for anyone coming from the Western tradition, it is always worth pausing and asking whether some of the assumptions of your own tradition, your own culture, your own political tradition are or not applicable or useful in different contexts. And, we're still there. There's what the argument is about China. It's what Lee Kuan Yew said. He said, look, managed democracy may be okay in Singapore, though I think it was more managed than democracy. But there is some difference between a city-state and a polity of China's scale. So again, and arguing that actually the result of implementing real democratic reform would be disintegration, and therefore anarchy, and therefore the restoration of some kind of worse, etc., 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 etc. You know the arguments, but they're worth tossing over in one's head. The one thing I would add, of course, it is important that in both cases the rulers had sufficient nous to realise that reforms were essential for survival.
Julian, I see you still have your hand up. Would you like to come back, or?
Yeah. I kind of working off of that. Do you view the creation of the Duma in 1905 as kind of a continuation of the idea that emperors need to adapt to challenges and various social issues of the time? Do you think it's in the same vein?
Yes, it clearly is. It's part of the same constitutional liberal tradition, and is explicitly seen that way on all sides. And of course, the liberal, and to an extent radical critique of the old regime is that they should have done this back in the 1860s. The conservative response was that look at what happens when you introduce multi-party politics into a deeply divided society, and beyond that into a multinational empire. So again, you can see the same arguments in a somewhat different context. But I don't think anyone doubted that the establishment of the Duma was to carry forward principles which had been asserted as far back as Catherine II in some ways, but of course, above all, had been brought into reality by Alexander II's reforms. It is an interesting question whether the Russians wouldn't have been better to actually have some kind of indirect system of representation, whereby, in other words, a central body was elected by the provincial zemstvas rather than by some version of equal male suffrage, but that gets you into bigger issues about the relevance or otherwise of the corporate state to Russia, because on the right, not by any means all, people on the right, but there is a, in the conservative Slavophile tradition, there is a strong dislike of the state bureaucracy monopolizing all political, what do you want to say, activity, a desire for society and to have a voice. There is suspicion about the applicability of Western parliamentary principles to Russia. And actually, look, I have some sympathy for the idea that if you were going to have some version of representation in Russia, which I think on the whole was a plus, because the regime needed to know what society was thinking, and it needed institutions through which society's wishes and could be expressed. I think you were probably going to be more likely to manage the balance between representation and effective state authority through some sort of system of indirect representation. The problem there was, apart from anything else, though, that the Russian intelligentsia, certainly the liberal intelligentsia, yearns for state-of-the-art Western shiny, institutions, and they feel it an insult to their dignity and their sense of status if Russia appears to have less democratic, less modern, less simply Western, because, for these people, Western is the mark of progress, modernity, status, you name it, success. It's taken for granted. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but you can see roughly where I'm heading.
Thank you.
Meredith?
Good morning. Or afternoon. I was wondering, so at the very end of your video lecture for today, you discussed this idea of Russia fighting World War I twice, and sort of the parallels between. And you said we could discuss this in more detail in this session. So I'm requesting more detail in this session.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, the First and Second World Wars are really the First World War Part 1 and Part 2. The basic issue in the biggest context is the German challenge to Anglo hegemony in the world in many ways. The reason why you have Part 1 and Part 2 is that, well, there are a number of reasons. But in the first place, it seems to me that the Western Allies would not have defeated Imperial Germany without American intervention. Without that, I think you were likely to get some version of stalemate peace, which probably would have incorporated an element of German victory. You see, if the Americans had not entered the war, and they were brought into it by foolish German policy as regards unrestricted submarine warfare, if they had not entered the war at exactly the moment when the Russian Revolution was destroying Russian power, I think Brest-Litovsk in the East would have, held the treaty, the peace treaty. What that means is German hegemony in East Central Europe, which means really German hegemony everywhere east of the Rhine. The Germans don't need to defeat the Western Allies to achieve that. Stalemate on the Western Front plus victory in the East is quite sufficient for that. And without the Americans, you were going to have stalemate on the Western Front. There was no way that the English and French, or the English and French and Italians, were going to defeat Germany and Austria without the Russians and without the Americans. One of the great ironies of the First World War is that a war which begins above all else in Eastern Europe as a struggle between Russia and the two Germanic empires, the Hohenzollerns and the Habsburgs, for domination of East Central Europe, ends with the defeat of all three empires and the disintegration of two of them. The trouble is, though, that the victory of the Western allies, in other words, France, Britain, America, couldn't happen without American power. And when the Americans retreat into isolation, the Versailles settlement becomes doubly vulnerable. Then the British do one of their periodic secessions from Europe, continental Europe, I'm being ironic. But also, to do them justice, they're to some extent forced in this direction by the fact that a vast global empire is being now sustained on shrinking relative resources. On top of that, to put things in slightly more concrete terms, Britain itself, even in the First World War, let alone the Second, depends enormously on the strength of the white dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. And they make it pretty clear after the First World War, and for entirely understandable reasons, that their young men are not going to die in their scores of thousands on European battlefields again, except in some absolutely life and death cause, So you've got the Versailles settlement, which reflects Western Allies' victory in the First World War, no longer sustained by American power and only partially by British power. France on its own is going to have a hell of a hard time sustaining the Versailles settlement in continental Europe. Even more fundamentally, the basic point is that potentially the two most powerful peoples in Europe, really, well, even now, actually, but certainly since the mid-19th century, with the Germans and the Russians. Now, it's one of the ironies of the First World War that both of them end up among the defeated. The Versailles settlement is made against Germany, but almost as much against Russia. The trouble is you have a hell of a hard time sustaining a settlement which is made against potentially, latently, the two most powerful peoples and polities in continental Europe. And if it's going to be difficult to sustain that settlement against Germany and against Russia, it's going to be even more difficult if you haven't even got any longer the Americans on board or even the British entirely on board. So the Versailles settlement is going to collapse. The question is how, when, and with what consequences, I think, You have the additional problem that, I didn't really have time to go into this in any detail, but, if in the 1930s, you were going to try and adopt the pre-1914 strategy for deterring Germany, that means resuscitating the old Franco-Russian alliance and Triple Entente, Russia, France, Britain. On top of all the other problems, you've now got the fact, though, that, this isn't Russia, this is the Soviet Union, this is a communist state. And fairly enough, very wide circles in France and Britain loathe Soviet Russia. And if they had to choose, would probably choose fascist Germany, certainly fascist Italy, over communist Russia. Of course, that's above all the elites, but it's too simplistic to say that it's just a question of elite self-interest. Look, I've read people saying this at the time. Hitler in 1938 is saying he's going to do all sorts of awful things and kill endless numbers of people. Stalin has done it on a grand scale, and that isn't a secret to those who want to know in either Paris or London ruling circles. So there is quite a good moral argument for saying, if we oppose Hitler in alliance with Stalin's Russia, that means handing over Eastern Europe to Soviet communism, which is indeed what happened after 1945. Geopolitics is a relatively crude and simple business, and 2 + 2 always equals 4. So, you were in a hell of a difficult position. What Stalin did, now I'm turning it around to look at things from the Russian perspective, what he actually did in 1939 in the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was exactly what, some of my old heroes, above all, Pyotr Donavo, but, a significant strain on the right of the Tsarist elite. They had urged Nicholas II to do a deal with Germany and basically encourage the Germans to go west, give the Kaiser all the support and backing he wanted, in his campaign to challenge British maritime power. Encourage his great speeches about Germany's future lying on the water, reckoning on the fact that if the British and French on the one hand and the Germans faced each other for a generation, neither was likely to destroy the other. And that would give Russia security for a generation in which the Russian economy, which before 1914 was the most quickly growing economy in Europe, it could grow, and at the same time, 20 years of economic development and political consolidation would, so the conservative argument went, make Russia not just more formidable, but also less likely to disintegrate if faced by a European war. Well, Nicholas II and the great majority of the Tsarist elite, including, the top governmental elite, rejects the Donovo approach before 1914 and instead opts for the alternative, which is a strategy of deterrence in alliance with France and Britain. Well, it doesn't work. It doesn't deter Germany. In the end, it does defeat Germany, but only at the expense of the collapse of Russia into revolutions and the whole bloody lot. What Stalin does in 1939 is, as I say, what Donovo and co had urged Nicholas II to do before 1914. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is designed to steer Germany westwards into a war which start with France and Britain that Stalin thinks is going to last for a generation, in which, while everybody else, the other European great powers, are exhausting themselves, communist Russia will grow more and more powerful economically, will consolidate its political system, and, in a generation's time will be unequivocally much the most powerful state in Europe. The thing is, it goes wrong for Stalin too, because actually in 1940, to his astonishment and horror, his prediction about the French and British on the one hand and the Germans on the other, stalemating each other, turned out to be wrong. The Germans defeat the French in 6 weeks at the cost of 60,000 dead, which is a trifle by First World War standards, kick the British across the Channel, and Stalin finds himself stuck in the same position as Alexander I in 1811. In other words, he's got on his western border a formidable aggressive power which controls the resources of virtually all continental Europe. I mean, to do Stalin justice, and I don't like doing Stalin justice, he was a vicious and evil tyrant. But I would, in his position, I'd have probably made the same calculation in 1939. And it is the case that if Hitler's victory astonished and appalled Stalin, well, I mean, astonished and appalled the British and French as well, it actually also astonished most of the senior German generals. And it was because, Hitler had taken up, what was the man's name? The more junior general. God, it'll come back to me I'm getting old. The plan he adopted for going through the Ardennes was not the plan initially suggested by the general staff or supported by most senior German generals. It was what's his name? What's his name's plan, which Hitler takes up and pushes and radically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that does help to explain why from about June 1940 until the winter of 1941, most of the senior German generals are in complete awe at Hitler because he took these huge gambles in 1940 and they came off. Can you imagine? It looks as if you've won round 2 of the Second World War, of the First World War, in 6 weeks at the cost of 60,000 dead. This is miracle. This is complete, absolute miracle. Now, it all goes horridly wrong in the end, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not, I think for me I'm not trying to say that either the people who made the decision in 1914 or Stalin in 1939 were idiots. They weren't necessarily. These were very, very difficult judgments to make, with all sorts of unknowables involved, not least the competence of generals, the ability of the German armed forces to actually execute plans, however, et cetera. There are all sorts of unknowables. But it is pretty terrifying. I remember when the first book I wrote, it wasn't my thesis, but the first book I wrote was a little book called Russia and the Origins of the First World War. And I remember reading all those dispatches by Russian diplomats before 1914, in the years just before. These were not usually, brilliant men, but they were not usually stupid men. And by the standards of their time and class, they were, on the whole, decent. And then you read these dispatches and you realized that if you added it all up, you're probably talking about, if you had the First World War, the revolution, the famine, the Bolshevik terror, the dictatorship, the second famine, the collectivization, and then Stalin's terror, and then the Second World War, all of which, in a sense, are a consequence of Russia getting involved in the First World War. You're talking about 50 million Russians dead, Russians in inverted commas, subjects of the emperor, which does just bring home how completely devastating international relations can be. And that's, now you're just talking about the Russians or, former subjects of the Tsar dead. If you begin adding all the other people who go down the drain in Europe, this is all pretty terrifying. I mean, it is sort of sobering to realize just what the stakes can be in international relations, and just how difficult some of the calculations are. And we haven't escaped. A lot of the fundamental dilemmas and debates are very similar to, now wondering about Taiwan, wondering about, how the Chinese leadership is going to act, trying to work out the mentalities of key decision makers, trying to work out what the impact of domestic politics is going to be on foreign policy. Looking at the shift in the European balance or the global balance, it's quite interesting, actually, and this really is relevant now. I remember when I was working on this first book, which by now is decades ago, but one of the things I did was to, of course, work in the British archives and look at what the British Embassy in St. Petersburg was saying. And there was this wonderful moment in about 1910, I think it was, when a character called Mikhail Menshikov, who was an extremely unpleasant man, an anti-Semite. He was a sort of proto-Nazi, but he was clever, very clever. And like a goodly swathe of the Russian elite at that time, although he was very nervous about what was going on in, particularly German power, in the long run, he said the greatest challenge to Russian security was going to be the rebirth of Chinese power. But, he said, this is going to be a matter of almost certainly at least 2 to 3 generations, or at least 2, perhaps 3. And he said by then British rule in India would long since have collapsed, and India would be Russia's natural geopolitical ally against Chinese hegemony in Asia. And this was all sent back, this was cut out and translated and sent back to the Foreign Office in London by the embassy with little exclamation marks about it. But it's pretty shrewd stuff. But I mean, roll it on to now. What you've actually got, and it's been underlined and hardened by this war in Ukraine, is essentially a contemporary version. I said this before to you, I don't think I probably did, of the old court strategy of 19th century Russian foreign policy. In other words, the alliance with Germany and Austria. The 3 Eastern monarchies allying both on ideological principle and on the basis of this is the best way to preserve their territorial integrity and security. This is the Holy Alliance, 1815. This is the Dreikaiserbund of the 1870s. Well, mutatis mutandis, you've got the same thing working out now in the alliance with China. I mean, obviously there is ideological solidarity, dislike of Western and particularly American democracy, fear of, the impact and from the perspective of the regimes, the disastrous impact of Western democratic ideas on their own position, political stability in Russia and China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is also a very powerful prudential geopolitical point. Russia has an enormous boundary with China, having smashed itself to bits twice. Firstly, trying to block German hegemony in Europe in 2 world wars, and then, of course, getting itself involved in a confrontation with the Anglo-Americans in the Cold War. And the Anglo-Americans having had vastly greater resources than Russia. Do you really want to blunder your way now into a confrontation with China? No, you certainly do not. And least of all, in alliance, particularly with the United States, when you know damn well you have no natural sympathizers in Washington. and that you simply cannot rely on how American politics will evolve. You might be left out there to dry, hanging out to dry in faced with a confrontation with China. You simply can't predict what's going to happen. And frankly speaking, that most members of Congress would sell Russia in order to get 20,000 more votes, in deeper Idaho or something. So, it isn't just ideological solidarity. It's also geopolitics, just as it was with the old, court strategy. So-called in the 19th century. So it's actually quite interesting to look at. But one of the effects of this Ukrainian war has been to increase the inequality of the relationship between Russia and China. China is a far more powerful country than Russia. It is very dangerous being in a relationship with someone who is so much more powerful than you are. That was the old argument for keeping in with the Germans in particular. There were economic arguments as well, but in this case, economics and geopolitics are all wrapped in together. But the Russians have burnt their boats with Germany, I suspect, for a generation now. And therefore, you're even more in an unequal relationship with China. India might be a way out. To what extent is Russian foreign policy going to be sufficiently intelligent and flexible to keep up a good relationship with India without alienating the Chinese? Never easy. And it becomes less and less easy the more dependent you become on China because you burnt your boats elsewhere. So, you've got all sorts of fascinating parallels with, pre-1914 and 19th century foreign policy. But of course, as always, very important, specific, contemporary wrinkles, differences, you name it. But it is a fascinating one. And I think my own sense is you've got to be a bit careful. I think the more intelligent IR people of course know this, but when one turns on the news and talks about the international community condemning Russia over Ukraine, the international community doesn't exist in that sense. The Indians haven't condemned Russia. Most African states haven't condemned Russia. Most South American states haven't condemned Russia. China, of course, hasn't condemned Russia. And the basic point is that whereas in the 1990s, and to a certain extent, certainly in the 19th century, of course, but to a certain extent, even after 1914, after 1918, you could equate the international community with the West. You certainly can't do that any longer, because we're looking at the end of 300 years of, possibly 350 years of Western, in inverted commas, or Latin European hegemony. Probably 300 years of, Anglo, again, the Anglo-American. Because in a sense, it seems to me we are still just about living in the world which was created as much as anything in the 7 Years' War, in other words, 1756 to 63. It looked as if that world had been held under the waterline by the American War of Independence. One of the Britain was more under threat in the 1780s than it ever was again until 1939. The British came out of that war not just badly damaged by loss of the American colonies, but with the second, third, and fourth naval powers in Europe, the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish, arrayed against them. And it's actually terribly interesting to look at the 1780s and how the British very intelligently responded to that crisis. In a way, they're rescued by the French Revolution. But the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the two World Wars, and the Cold War are, in a sense, attempts to overthrow the basic international order created, in 1756 to 63, and they all failed at huge cost. Well, I suspect now what we're looking at is the most fundamental challenge that order has had. And of course, if you're looking at things from the perspective of Xi Jinping or Putin, they do fear American power and they fear democracy. But, I suspect, I don't know the two gentlemen in question, but, if learned American academics can write interesting and pretty plausible books about the coming civil war in America, it's not particularly surprising that Xi Jinping and Putin might think that the future belongs to them. Because certainly, if one had a scenario, let us say, at the next or the election after that, in the presidential in the United States, and the vote was closer than it was last time, with a Supreme Court which is in the Republican camp, more to the point, with so many of the key state legislatures, in Republican hands and perfectly willing, possibly by then, to play fast and loose with traditional interpretations of constitutional principle. You wouldn't have a civil war like 1861 to 1865, but you could have a very significant amount of domestic conflict and paralysis. At that point, all bets would be off, And if Squeaky Lieven can think in these terms, and not as a probability, no, but as certainly as a genuine possibility, well, you can bet anything you like that an awful lot of people talking to Putin, and possibly also to Xi Jinping, are saying just the same. The difference being that Putin's more desperate because Russia is basically in secular decline, whereas I suspect the people in Beijing think they're going to inherit the earth, so they've got a vested interest in not destroying it first. I mean, these are all rambling ideas, but, you really set me off. But again, you've got to be careful with history, but you have also got to understand it and see the parallels and spot the differences.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry if it's loud in the background here. I had problems with my internet at home today, so I had to go to a cafe. It's not
really as loud here. I've got these barbarians.
Well,
drilling still. It's as if I'm in the middle of the bloody First World War myself in some trench in Verdun. Sorry, that's just me.
I had drilling yesterday myself, so I can definitely relate with you.
We'll go on an anti-drilling crusade. On you go, Mac.
Yeah. Well, we can plan some crusade after this. So I realized in retrospect that in all of the days that we've been talking, I've been asking questions that would have been more appropriate to ask the next day. So in the first day when we were talking about emperors, I asked about empire more generally. And then yesterday when we were talking about empires more generally, I asked about the Russian Empire. So I thought today would be appropriate to continue with my unplanned tradition and ask a question about the non-lecture that we're going to have today or tomorrow.
Don't worry.
So my question is, it's kind of a personal question. They're not too personal. I wanted to ask you, what is it about empires that really just attracts you? What is it about empires that really keeps you fascinated? Because, I mean, you've been studying empires and Russia in particular for decades now. What is it that keeps you coming back? And what questions are there out there that you're still sort of pondering and not totally sure?
Okay, Matt, I can answer that in a way that you're not supposed to answer things as an academic, but actually you usually can on two levels. You could ask, and what you're probably going to get from me mostly is an intellectual defense of why I've spent much of my life thinking about empires and writing about them and this and that. And you get it in a second. But if you want the true sort of psychological, sort of autobiographical response, I remember at about the age of 4, I was obsessed by the Titanic. Large, unequal, beautiful, but deeply flawed system suddenly sinking overnight. It must have touched some sort of nerve inside my gloomy being. And I was completely obsessed by this for years. So I suspect, if you're honest with yourself, you've got the same basic urges and nuttiness that you had at the age of 2 or 3. You've just become a bit more sophisticated in the way that you play to your fantasies and your interests. I mean, that's just a purely personal autobiographical comment. And I could talk about the fact that, after all, I was brought up with older relatives around who just told fascinating stories about empires. Because my mum's mum was born and married in India, lived most of her life in British India. Got me really worked up. I mean, her idea of bedtime stories for a 5-year-old, she's got these books about man-eating tigers and leopards, all to do with British India. So blow me down. I used to barricade myself in my bedroom and on the top floor of a 6-story house in London, central London, convinced I was about to be eaten by a tiger. barricaded myself, slept with knives and sort of torches, even a compass in case the tiger carried me off to Kensington Gardens, forgot to eat me, and I had to get my way home. I mean, complete lunacy. So, I mean, again, autobiography. But that isn't really what you wanted to hear about. If you want an intellectual defense of why I'm interested in empire, I think it's because empires mattered, really, and still do. An awful lot of what is most important about world history is the history of empires. But as I've said, I mean, the most important empires are not just powerful in terms of hard power. They're also of enormous importance in terms of soft power. They don't just determine which elite, which polity rules large sections of the world for long periods. They also, and more importantly, determine which values in the end triumph, which perceptions of human beings place in the great scheme, all this kind of stuff. So they matter. And I think it's also very interesting to look at the contemporary world order through the prism of empire, which doesn't at all mean imagining that, the present United States People's Republic of China, India, or putatively, the European Union, or even Putin's Russia. They're not empires in the full traditional sense of the word, but I think you understand them better by asking yourself in what ways they are and in what ways they are not similar to traditional empires. So those would be my main intellectual sort of defenses for why I've been so interested in empire. You could also come at it from a sort of point of view of high culture. A lot of the really great civilizations is, sounding a bit too Toynbee-esque and grandiose, but you know what I mean, are associated with empire. And empires did play a role, certainly the great traditional land empires of Eurasia, in the movement not just of goods, but of ideas. And that's fascinating to watch and important as well. Just one of, I don't know why I picked it off, just like that by chance. Or that chapter I wrote on the Caliphate and dear old Abdul al-Mamun, Caliph, who in a sense was the Caliph I probably talked about more than any other in that chapter. But, it wasn't just him, but he did play a very significant role in patronizing the translation and absorption, not just of Greek, but also of Indian classical thinking, mathematics, medicine, the lot, into Arabic, which then becomes, a medium for transmission of what are initially, as I say, Greek, Persian, Indian ideas, their preservation sometimes, and then, in a language which is in time picked up in the Renaissance by Europeans, and that has an enormous impact in the longer-term development of modern ideas about science and the whole gamut. That's empire. That's empire. That really is only possible in a great cosmopolitan metropolis like Baghdad, which brings together people from all sides, and indeed patronizes people who represent the best of the intellectual, artistic, you name it, cultural traditions of their background. So, I mean, all empires aren't like that, but it is a facet of empire. So again, that would be a reason to be fascinated by it. It's hard not to be fascinated by the society of 10th century or 9th century Baghdad, for instance. That's all I'd say.
Thomas?
Hey, Professor Lieven.
Hello.
Nice to talk to you. My name is Thomas. I'm a graduate student at Indiana University.
Uh-huh.
And when I was reading your book,
Russia program, or which program are you in? Sorry,
yes,
I looked at your bios, but I'd forgotten them all. What?
I study at the Russian program, but also public policy.
Okay.
So
good.
In that vein, the CEO whisperer kind of connection really spoke to me throughout this book.
Isn't it an interesting book?
Very, yes.
Yeah.
I've seen parts of it, but I haven't read it. So I'm looking forward to.
It's very small,
Yeah. But when I was reading your book, it was really interesting to me how that aspect of leadership came out again and again. On one hand, you had, an emperor who was not very intellectual, but had these great people skills, had this great management capacity. Sure. And on the other hand, you had, in the last example from Brazil, Dom Pedro, I believe, who was extremely intelligent, extremely insightful from an academic sense, but that kind of went out of style, as you said, by 1880 or whenever that was. So I just, leadership is something that everyone in this room has to deal with at some point in their career. It's a make or break in most cases. I don't think any of us will be, in the shadow of the gods, or like, we're not going to be probably an empire, most likely not a CEO, maybe. Sure. But that leadership aspect, I'm just curious, you did such an incredible deep study on leaders, and I was just hoping maybe you could speak more on that and talk about anything you thought was really interesting, or something that, in this room, as we move forward, we should kind of take away from that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. And here you really are dealing with a pathetic level of leadership. But, I was twice head of different departments at LSE. And managing academics is not the easiest thing on earth, particularly since certainly in the British system, you don't have much power over your colleagues. If they decide to dig their heels in, they're basically hard to shift. So, you do learn some of the skills. I think you also learn, if you've got any sense quickly, what are your powers, what are not your powers, to what extent you can use a stick, to what extent you have a carrot to offer. You also have to work out, that you have a relationship with the people who are in your department, just as even a monarch has a relationship with his ministers. And a relationship between two human beings does to some extent depend on their characteristics. When I was head, I'm a bloody awful bully. I knew it was absolutely pointless, me trying to bully my colleagues, because it would upset me much more than it would upset them. So you've also got to know what kind of person you are. This constant refrain you got from the more intelligent emperors when talking to their heirs, know yourself, understand yourself, to use horrible modern jargon, interrogate yourself, which is in a way not that different to what every confessor of a Catholic monarch would say, It's rather interesting. I was talking to my daughter about this, who's a product of humanities, Oxford, this and that, but then McKinsey's and Co. talking about coaches. There is this, and to what extent a CEO benefits from having a coach. Well, was a Catholic confessor a coach? No. But, a Catholic confessor felt it was his duty to involve himself in public policy as well, to steer the monarch in the direction of a truly Christian public policy, apart from anything else. So he was a kind of coach, and certainly Richelieu was a coach to Louis XIII, this extraordinarily delicate, conflicted, rather weird king with all his insecurities and this and that, but his absolute determination to hang on to his power and his his belief that his power was essential to France's good, and that relationship with Richelieu. So one thing I say, I can't remember I said in the book, but the people I'm studying are not like the kind of leaders that you and I know in the contemporary world, let alone that you and I will ever be. They were, for a start, in most cases seen as sacred or semi-sacred. They were also sovereign. They couldn't be removed. They were responsible to nobody. And there are all sorts of other things, but particularly if you're talking about a Louis XIV, whose family at one level has been on a throne for 700 years. You're talking about leaders with a confidence and an aura that nobody nowadays can really match, because that is not just a question of terror. It's not just a question of sticks and carrots, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, if you were a human being attempting to, achieve goals, knowing, as any leader does, that you have to pick lieutenants and use lieutenants to create some kind of team in order to achieve these goals, well, there are certain things in common. There are certain things in common. There are certain usually rather banal characteristics. I mean, the reviews of my book have been very nice, but I know one of them, for your average historian at the moment has been brought up on the cultural turn and highly rarefied discussions about symbols and representation and this and that and everything else. Talking about leaders in the ordinary English language of a business school is banal. And yet, we're banal little creatures, and never more so than we're actually trying to exercise leadership. These are relatively basic qualities, I mean, it's a bit like Clausewitz on war, everything in war is simple, but simple things are very difficult. You read one of these tomes on leadership from the business school literature, and it just seems so bloody obvious. You think, then you actually get put face to face with human beings, and you try and corral them and shoe and shepherd them into acting in ways so that instead of all fighting each other, they actually work together to achieve a goal which you have tried to, put across. It sounds wonderfully simple, but it's actually bloody complicated. And I love Charles V's, memoranda for his son in that sense. I mean, there was a lovely sort of bit on one minister who was quite obviously, a complete Burke in many ways, but lots of advice about how you tickled him under the chin and set him going in the right direction and made sure that he, this and that and everything else, that he'd had his cup of coffee after lunch, because otherwise he went to sleep. And then sort of more or less in brackets, but for God's sake, whatever else you do, don't stir up his wife, because if you do that, everything will fall to bits, etc. So I mean, this is, apart from anything else, at the top. And this is still true at the top in politics. It is a little village. It is a little village. You've got a very small group of people, most of whom have got some very sharp elbows, many deep insecurities, and, the whole rampant and often rather fragile egos. You've somehow got to get these people to operate so that they don't just destroy each other and paralyze institutions. One reason why bureaucratic institutions sometimes, you get people relatively mediocre, but basically quite nice individuals who rise to surprising high levels, is that it's a bit like having insulation around electricity. If you get all the bright sparks and no insulation, the whole bloody thing blows up because, etc. So again, it's interesting. The thing again you see is that to an even greater extent than in a contemporary system, or perhaps actually presidential systems, it is a bit like this, but by definition, you don't have political parties exercising a sort of conformist discipline on very ambitious top politicians. These sort of self-actors. So the monarch's got to be sort of lion tamer. What was her name? Kearns, and talking about Abraham Lincoln, his ability to actually have very determined, very competent, very ambitious rivals in his cabinet and to keep them under control. Well, again, he's got institutional power behind him. He does, in the last, have the right to sack him. But, that's not that different to a monarch who, if he's going to, achieve his goals, has got to be able to get competent lieutenants and get them to work together. I could go on about this forever. But in that sense, leadership is leadership is leadership. In another sense, of course, quite obviously, if you're trying to put together a team of ferocious sort of warrior courtiers, if you're a nomadic emperor, you have to manage your team with a slightly different mixture of sticks and carrots than if you're trying to organize Confucian bureaucrats or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Different elites have their different characteristics. Different political systems have different conventions. And a monarch can do something in one political culture, political tradition, which he absolutely can't in others. He'd ruin himself. So there are many nuances, but there are still certain, to my mind anyway, certain common patterns as you run, because the most basic, look, if you're going to sit there for year after year after year, trying to cope with these intolerable, ambitious sort of, politicos, and trying to adjudicate issues, make decisions, sometimes, particularly if you think about China, really quite complex decisions, on grand scale issues of hydraulic policy or tax policy or this or that. This is bloody exhausting. So you've got, it stands to reason. You've got to have various ways to keep yourself going. And one can find all sorts of ways. The least happy are the Mughals, for whom they're a great lot, but in many cases, the way out was incredible amounts of drink and drugs. Not the best way to keep going. At other extremes, you have dear old Yongzheng, who, in a very modern way, takes to Zen Buddhism and meditation and sort of etc. It's all rather fun. And of course, the obsessive hunting, it isn't just, as you get in the cultural history books, to do with, restaging martial arts and also bringing male courtiers into it. It is about that as well, and that's important. But it is also, at its most simple, a wonderful way to escape from the burdens of office. And also, of course, to a certain extent, it allows a degree of informality, which is very, very, very difficult at court. So there are all sorts of ins and outs, this and that. But I think maybe it's an illusion. I think the book is of some interest to people in business schools. Some interest.
Daniel?
Yeah, thank you very much for all your great answers. Along the lines of the previous two questions, since this is our last session, another question about some of your takeaways. You've spent decades studying the Russian Empire. And of course, this book, your most recent book, expands the scope of what you're trying to cover. And so therefore, I wanted to ask two kind of questions, one about process and the other also about some of your takeaways. At this point, after studying the Russian empires for decades, but in this case, expanding the scope of what you're covering, with the contrast of all of the other empires that you delved into, was there something that you rediscovered or something that perhaps changed the way you looked back at the Russian Empire, which is your field of, which has been your focus for so many years?
Sure.
And then the second thing, you said it took about 6 years for you to research and write this book. I don't know how that compares to some of your previous books, but in terms of your process and how you researched and I guess the question that I'm trying to get at is, when do you know that you're prepared to embark on this journey, to put pen to paper with such a book? And I was wondering whether the pandemic in any way affected your approach as well, being hunkered down and perhaps isolated.
Sure. No, good questions. I mean, the first question is to some extent to ask about the value of the comparative method. Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is that already, the third book I wrote was a comparative history of English, German, and Russian aristocracy, 1815 to 1914. So I'd done a bit of that, comparison already, and that fed back into what was initially my thesis, but was not published for about 10 years after my thesis, which was Russia's rulers under the old regime. Although that was fundamentally based on a vast amount of Russian archival research, it did also benefit from the fact that by the time I'd actually wrote it for the book, I had done quite a bit of research for this book on European aristocracy. So I was already to some extent thinking in a comparative way. Then, I wrote my, fifth book, it's called Empire, the Russian Empire and its Rivals. That was explicitly comparative, Russia and other empires, and Russia was probably, it was about a third, perhaps, in the way that it had been in aristocracy in Europe, all of which is a long-winded way of saying that, I had built up. I didn't come to comparative method just for this last book, and I had already explicitly done sort of Russian other comparisons. And after all, I set up and taught for many years an MSc course at LSE, which was comparative empire, basically. So, all these little things were whizzing around in my mind anyway. Again, the risk of going off at a tangent. I took off in terms of comparative method, partly, I think, for good intellectual reasons. I think it is actually very useful. I think it's probably particularly useful for a Russianist because the assumption, certainly among Russians, even more than among most people, is that their own history is completely unique, they're unique, et cetera, et cetera. And quite a lot of Western historians of Russia were much too inclined, either out of dislike of Russia or of, on the contrary, stressing its complete uniqueness. Well, of course, it was unique, but at the same time, comparisons were useful. It wasn't, you were still dealing with humans on two layers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say, and this actually helped me when I was head of department, certainly with some of the younger female colleagues in the department who were, trying to wrestle with this business of managing careers and small children. Well, we had the money to have help, but nevertheless, my wife was much more away than in London, when our children were small. So I was the parent in residence, which made going off and working in archives in Russia impossible. And that was an additional incentive to go comparative. It meant that I could combine, I thought, interesting, academic work, which did, in my own sort of, perhaps not humble, but it grow my intellect and everything in my imagination. But I could combine that with being the parent in residence, and I took my children to the nursery, my university every day. So, all I'm saying about that is that if you're plotting careers, and particularly, if you are a young woman trying to plot a career and a family in a world where, in most cases, you will still probably de facto be bearing more of the burden, it's quite crafty to try and plot to do academic work which suits your particular, this particular moment in your life, etc. So all of those things came in, and all of them came in. So that is process. Just looking at this book and I tell you what, it's sometimes, that book on aristocracy in Europe, for instance, I think there was a lot there already, but it was actually in some ways only when I got to the next book that I was really able to sharpen some of the conclusions I'd come to when I was writing the previous one. And in a way, one element in this last book, it was by no means, the most important element, but I was making comparisons between Russian elites, for instance, and Latin European elites, and Islamic polity elites, and that meant both the Ottomans and the Mughals, the Chinese, Confucian bureau, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, to some extent, that is something I've been doing now for 30 years, 35 years. After all, that was partly aristocracy in Europe. It certainly came into Russia's rulers under the old regime, where I was making explicit comparisons with Prussia, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the culmination of that. I've never before been able really systematically to think about where the old Russian landowning nobility fits in to that whole spectrum of imperial elites. And I think I said this in one of my 3 lectures, but maybe not. If you start at one end with slaves of the Ottoman Sultan, and then you get to the Chinese Confucian bureaucracy, and then you wiggle your way back towards, let's say, the Mughal new service nobility, and there are others as well. You then travel a bit further, well beyond 50% of the journey, before you get to the Russians, who are distinct from the West, the Latin European feudal aristocratic elite, but they're much closer to it than most of the other imperial elites. And that tells you something immediately. And when I say closer, I mean structurally, long before you get to cultural issues and the fact they speak French, not Chinese. So that would be one. that is a sort of something that comes out. One of the things immediately that strikes you once you begin making comparisons between Russian Empire and any other empires, and it's where I started my talk, is just where the Russian Empire is. Most great empires, at least in part, derive enormous benefits, wealth from tapping great international trade routes. The Russians couldn't. Most great agrarian empires grow up in the great fertile river valleys. Russia didn't. So, the comparison in this case doesn't show you how like Russia is to something else. It reinforces the extraordinariness of, the challenge of creating an empire in this particular geopolitical setting. By which I mean geographical, but also geopolitical, next to the steppe, you name it, on the borders of Latin Europe. So again, that you only get that kind of perspective through comparison, I think. So I would make that point. I could go on forever, but those kind of issues, comparison doesn't usually give you clear answers. But one of its great advantages is that it shakes up assumptions, which become absolutely rooted in the traditional historiography about a specific country. There are certain kind of things which are simply taken for granted if you're a historian of Russia. They've been said over and over and over again. And Russia, in that sense, is not different. A national historiography can be very narrow. It can hammer on about certain kinds of themes, questions. Sometimes going comparison just makes you ask different questions. And it makes you question lots of assumptions, because things which are being assumed in one country are absolutely not assumed or even accepted in another historiographical tradition. So it shakes you up. It gets you to ask questions. It sometimes gets you to ask fundamental questions. It doesn't usually give you straight answers. And I am sufficiently old-fashioned to go along with the old idea that before you become a comparativist, you do actually need to have a detailed, real knowledge of a specific period, a specific polity, a specific culture. Not to mention just the most basic point about, your ability to gather and interpret source material. Sorry, that was a long-winded response. But you do, again, have to realize that although I was never a political scientist, I was for 31 years in the politics department of LSE. So actually this book, some historians won't like this book because they don't like this kind of level of comparison. They're rumbling around asking where the sources were and how I can possibly write something about the caliphate when I can't read Arabic, etc.
But if I could follow up, just because I am curious, just the impact the pandemic has had on.
I didn't answer that. Well,
that's fine.
I was lucky. Look, I was lucky. The one person you don't need to feel sorry for in a pandemic is somebody who's trying to write a book, who's got his materials with him, and who has large quiet houses in which to operate. I was fortunate in the sense I had finished my time in Cambridge. I finished that in September, retired in September 2019, because in Cambridge and Oxford in England, you still retire at 67. So I had gathered most of my materials in my library in the countryside in Japan, because I was going to write most of the book there. So when as the pandemic came over the horizon, I concentrated even more of my materials in Japan and sat in our country house in Japan, did all the writing there. I always do my research first and then write the whole book at a go. So there I was sitting, from my study, I can see, on a good day, I can see 150 kilometers from my study window over Mount Fuji and the Pacific Ocean. So, it's not bad. And I was the only inhabitant of the house because my wife, son were in Tokyo in the house there. So that was fine. I came back to London because I got the notes really for my last 2 chapters or 2.5 chapters in London. I had to come back. But that was all right because I came back again. We got a big house in London. I was there on my own. And my daughter lives within 15 minutes walk, looked after me. So it's paradise. I mean, if you're writing a book, you don't need company. On the contrary, you need not to be bothered. So in that sense, the pandemic was perfect. I mean, it wasn't perfect in other ways, of course. But in terms of getting the book written, it was no problem whatsoever. Of course, in that sense, I was hugely lucky. If I'd been at an earlier stage, or if I hadn't been plotting to write the book and therefore concentrated my notes, most of my library in Japan, I'd have been in trouble. Or if I was obviously trying to find sources which required actually being in an archive. And I've known plenty of colleagues who are in those situations, just as, younger colleagues. I mean, it's been an absolute nightmare for some of them, sitting in a small flat with squeaky children, or, slightly older colleagues who've got bumptious teenagers, locked up in the flat with them. No space, lots of noise, having to do all, teaching commitments and do all your teaching and administration online. Absolute bloody nightmare. So, you can divide the academics, I know, between those who mostly through good luck, though sometimes through crafty preparation, actually, if anything, benefited from the pandemic to get things done, and those who, on the contrary, were sabotaged. I was one of the lucky ones.
Thank you for indulging me there.
Yeah.